Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Power Wash Simulator. Let's rant with Scrapper, where we sort of chill out washing dirty stuff. This is a bonus mission, the miniature golf. I don't think I've done this yet on camera. And we talk about role playing games and stuff about role playing and playing them and game mastering them and stuff like that. So, today we're doing this bonus mission. We won't get through the whole thing because it's huge, but we'll start at the bottom and work our way up the way we always do, and we'll start, kind of on the floor, and you know how I like to do that, and we'll kind of clean our way around the different holes, and we'll do the entrance here and that sort of thing. So as we go, today what I want to do is talk about character concept, and um, stuck here, hang on. I want to talk about character concept and building characters for concept versus for, say, optimization. So this discussion comes from let me just check the volume here. I think it looks okay. Um, comes from a couple of different sources. Um, one being the Deadlands adventure we just finished in my group, which is called Coffin Rock, and the discussion we had after that. And then the other being a friend of mine talking about Pathfinder and the game he's playing of Pathfinder 2 and character builds and that sort of thing in Pathfinder. And so, and I would say right now I've never played Pathfinder 2. I only know it by reputation. So I might get some things wrong about it, but we're going to be talking more about just sort of concepts of game design and character design. So it really shouldn't matter whether the details, what the details are of a particular game like Pathfinder. So this started, we finished our Coffin Rock adventure on Saturday. Today's Monday. And unfortunately, my best friend wasn't present. He had to miss the session. We played without him. It was nearly the end of the adventure, and it actually took us about maybe an hour and 45 minutes to finish. And then, since we had a lot of time, we started talking about what was going to come next. Now, one of the problems is what might be coming next is my best friend's D&D campaign. We simply don't know, and he wasn't there to ask him because he couldn't make it. So we're not sure, and a couple of us are going away in June, and so right now it's Memorial Day today. And so we kind of put things on hold until the middle of June. One of the players, the girl in Finland, her family is visiting them from mid-June till the end of June. So we can't play a real session until July 1st, which is a Saturday, I believe. And then, but she said she does have some time where she can maybe meet with us for an hour or so to just talk about what we do next. So what we planned is in mid-June, the one Saturday, I think it's the 17th, can't remember the dates now, we're going to be just talking about what comes next, and then we'll hopefully begin playing something on July 1st, but we don't know what. And I suspect if it's going to be D&D, my best friend isn't going to be ready for July 1st because it's only 1 month from now, and he hasn't really said anything to me about prepping his campaign. And again, I feel like once he starts actually world building and generating a campaign, he's probably going to start asking me questions. Some of them will be, what do you want to see? And some of them will be, how did you do this when you were, making maps or whatever? And he hasn't done any of that, which makes me highly suspect that he hasn't really started yet. And that's fine, but if that's true, then I don't expect us to begin his campaign on, on July 1st. So, and, I kind of said that. I said, I don't know if he's going to be ready. What would you guys like to do? And we talked about, the game and Savage Worlds, and two of the players said, well, we really like Deadlands, and we wouldn't mind continuing to play in it. And so then I mentioned that the girl from Finland had said, when we were talking about playing other games, that she had some, D&D concepts that she had come up with for characters, and that she would be sad if she never got to play them. So we kind of talked about that. And I guess the one player said, well, could you play these concepts, in another game? And she said, well, maybe some, but she said some of the concepts that she came up with were very much tied to the mechanics of D&D, right? So this is like when I made up a Blade Singer wizard, and it was an elven Blade Singer, and I didn't have I keep hitting C. I didn't have a concept for like the personality, the drives, the motivations of the character before I sat down. The concept was she's a Blade Singer, right? And um, then after that character class idea, right? Then I came up with, okay, it's an elf. I came up with, because traditionally elves are blade singers. Um, Blade singers are elves traditionally. It's an elven, in the Forgotten Realms. It's an elven discipline. Why have I not cleaned this? Oh, here we go. What am I missing here? This one didn't clean. There we go. And so it was just, she's an elven blade singer was the concept. And so I had a really hard time role-playing her because I didn't have any character personality, behaviors, quirks. I didn't have those kinds of ideas. Okay. But sometimes, a class like that inspires you, and maybe you can play it. Maybe you do have a good idea for it. So, so some of her concepts are tied up in the mechanics of the game, right? And then I guess she has other character concepts that aren't necessarily tied to the mechanics of the game and could be played in a variety of games, right? Because one of the questions was, well, for your concepts, could you play them in Savage Worlds instead of D&D? And what she said was, well, yes and no. Some concepts, yes. Other concepts are sort of tied to the D&D mechanics specifically. Now, I did mention Pathfinder for Savage Worlds. I didn't get into class edges or any of that in Pathfinder for Savage Worlds because, we don't know what game we're liable to play next, right? And I don't know what's coming in that sense. So I didn't want to get too into the details, especially with my best friend not there, right? Because we don't know what he's going to want to do, if he's going to want to keep playing Savage Worlds. A couple of the players really want to actually keep playing Deadlands. They're really enjoying Deadlands specifically. And I certainly don't mind that because I love Deadlands and Savage Worlds. But, so we'll see what happens. But this is one way to build a character, right? You look at the rules and the classes and the abilities that are available in the rules, and you derive a character concept from the rules. For example, my best friend's character in Savage Worlds, in Deadlands, is a huckster, right? And so he looked at the huckster and said, this is a cool type of character. I want to play this. And he is then taking the various skills and edges that you take in order to play a huckster, right? But that's only one way to design a character, right? The other way to design a character is to come up with a non-mechanically based concept, right? A concept where you have a verbal idea of what I want this character to be, right? I want this character to be like Thor, okay, in Champions. And then having come up with that as a concept, then you use the game mechanics to derive the right mechanics for the concept that you're trying to do, right? So you say, okay, well, Thor has this hammer, right, that only he can lift. So like they talk about this in the Champions rules without naming Thor. They call him Norse Hammer God or something. Norse Storm God has a hammer that can be thrown and he can, pick it up and stuff. And at first it might seem like an obvious accessible focus, but only Norse Hammer God can lift it. Nobody else can. And so that actually means it's probably not a focus. It might be some other kind of a limitation. or just a special effect of his powers, because nobody else can lift it, right? Whereas the Super Patriot shield can be picked up by anybody else and probably is a focus, right? So when you're making those characters up, you choose the character elements of the mechanics that fit the concept that you came up with first, right? And so these are two different ways to design characters. And so what this player was basically saying is she has a bunch of character ideas, and some of them are mechanically based, and some of them are more like a verbal idea that can be done, adapted into any system. One way or another, you just figure out how the words that you're using to describe your character get manifested in, kind of the game mechanics, right? So those are kind of the two different ways, and um, and I feel like one of the things that I see happen a lot in with role playing games with players, and this is where the conversation with this other friend came in, who was talking about Pathfinder, is that a lot of players seem to struggle with, character design in the sense that's mechanical rather than conceptual. So he was telling me that in Pathfinder, apparently there's some app that, you put in what your character currently is, second level rogue with these abilities or whatever, and then the app will basically narrow down for you all of the different options that you could reasonably take and what their pros and cons are. Um, and he said it's overwhelming. There are so many things, and I'm not sure what to do. And I said to him, well, why don't you go with whatever fits your character concept? And he was like, well, I am. All of these things are available to rogues, right? And I said, but rogue is a class. It's not a character concept. And he was like, well, what do you mean? And I said, like, a character concept is something like, my character is like a hired killer who, or let's take a great example. I just read the second Lonesome Dove book, Streets of Laredo, and one of the main characters, Woodrow Call, is called a manhunter in the story. He is a former Texas Ranger who has a reputation of being able to be hired as a bounty hunter to go and find um, somebody who has a bounty on their head, right? So he's sort of a hired, almost like a hired lawman. He used to be law, right? He used to be a Texas Ranger, and they're, law for Texas, right? And so he's a former lawman whose ranger status still gives him some level of legal stature. He's still really not supposed to be going around murdering people, but, sheriffs will give him quite a bit of leeway because, he used to be a ranger and he's famous, right? So now with that concept, he's older, right? He's like in his late 60s. He's lost a step. He's got some arthritis and so on. And he's pretty good with guns and rifles, but he's not a super expert gunslinger. He's extremely smart, very patient, always gets his man, mostly because he is smart and patient and knows what he's doing, right? So now with that in mind as a concept, if you're going to build that character, say in Savage Worlds, there are some hindrances you could take, right? So let me stop here and just flip through the Savage Worlds core book and look at some hindrances. You might in Deadlands take the ailing hindrance because he's got he's got the arthritis and stuff. You might take something like let's see, loyal, right? Because he is very loyal. Bad eyes, right? His eyes aren't what they used to be. So you might give him bad eyes. You might give him cautious. enemy. There was elderly. Perfect. So elderly is a major disadvantage, major hindrance. Bad eyes and maybe ailing from Deadlands, right? So I took hindrances there that make sense for the character, right? And they're really easy to come up with because I have a concept, a verbal concept in mind for this character. Um, I think he also tough, tough as nails as an edge. That's a legendary edge. So, I mean, he obviously wouldn't be a starting character, but let's just look at some of the background edges. So I think he would be maybe, let's see, he would have the hard to kill and harder to kill um, edges. So he'd have hard to kill for sure. He would have level-headed for sure. He would probably have something like trademark weapon or maybe marksman. He was a leader, so he might have command, right? You see, I'm like coming up with way more edges than you could give a starting character, but he obviously wouldn't be a starting character. And so this is based on the concept rather than saying something like, I'm going to be a gunslinger, right? Which is kind of a class, or I'm going to be a fighter magic user cleric, right? Which is a set of classes. Does that make sense? And so, so I said, to me, what I would do is go with the concept of the character. And he was like, yeah, but you can do so much that, like, so then he listed all the different skills. And he's like, how do I know which one to pick? And I said, the one that fits the concept, right? If you're going for an older veteran ranger who's world weary and whatever, that's going to sort of suggest certain skills and abilities compared to a young impulsive sorcerer, right? Who's a spellcaster who relies on like luck and speed to do things, right? And so so I think that one of the reasons people get overwhelmed is that if you're going with a mechanical build, right? Like let's say you say I'm going to play a ranger, right? In D&D. Now you have to pick at third level what subclass are you going to play. And if your concept is I'm a ranger, right? Then there's not a particular reason to pick any of the particular subclasses, right? So how do you choose becomes a real question. People often get overwhelmed. Well, this subclass does this, and this subclass does that, and this subclass does that. And if you don't have any conceptual reason why you're going to pick them, then you start to get into like option overload, right? Because then you see people going online, looking for online builds, and there are pros and cons to all of these builds, right? And the fact that there are these pros and cons means that you you have to sort of try to think about, okay, well, what balances here? Like what's better? And then better may be, well, Monster Hunter might be better in this situation, and Gloomstalker might be better in that situation. And so you get people trying to, like, what they do is they'll tell you to pick the options that are sort of the min-maxing options. But since nobody's in your game group or watching you guys play, oftentimes these options are sort of just the ones that are generically good options, right? The idea being that, well, they're kind of the sort of the general use options that work well under most sort of typical circumstances. If your group isn't a typical group, those options might not really work for you, right? They might actually make things significantly harder for you to play, right? Or might not come into play as often as most people think they would, right? Most people assume that you're building for combat, And if you have a campaign that's low in combat, then those options might not be the best ones for you. Right? On the other hand, if you're building for concept, then your character, you don't have to worry about, is this optimal, right? Or even, is it going to be useful a lot? Because what you're trying to do is realize the concept. And I think that can often make the challenge of designing a character easier. Because what you're asking is, what should this character have, rather than what would be really useful to have. There's he's being overwhelmed by these choices in Pathfinder, and he needs the Pathfinder character designer app to help him, because there are so many options, and each one of them is good in a different way, right? And without a strong concept, there's no particular reason to pick any one of the options. And as a result, that leads to you getting into sort of being overwhelmed by the options. It can make it a huge challenge to try and come up with which level up options you're going to pick, or even which character creation options you're going to pick. Right? The options can often be overwhelming, and if you have a good firm concept in your head, then a lot of times the decision is made for you. Right? So my ranger, who has a vendetta against a particular monster and wants to be able to kill this monster, it was just sort of obvious that he's going to be a monster hunter. Right? So that subclass decision, I didn't have to look up subclasses and figure out which ones are the most efficient or whatever. I was able to just say, I'm going to make him a monster hunter because that's what he conceptually would be. Okay? So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, if you're struggling with figuring out how to design your character, what options to take when you advance or level up or gain XP and champions, right? What do I take next? And champions in particular can be difficult, right? You've saved up 15 experience points. You've been saving them up because you have no idea what to do with them, and you can do anything. Right? You can buy any power, you can buy any skill that you can justify to the GM. Right? So what do you do? If you're playing, let's say, Spider-Man, right? And you've assumably already got your danger sense, your webbing, your wall crawling, your swinging, your jumping, your martial arts, spider martial arts, right? What do I take next? What's the character concept, right? He's a spider guy. Okay, so what powers? Does it make sense to get teleport for him? No, because spiders can't teleport, right? Does it make sense to get some kind of a poison sting ability? Well, maybe yes, right? Because spiders can be poisonous and they can bite you and make you very sick, right? Even kill you if it's the right spider, right? The right type of spider, the right species. And so, if you have a concept in mind, then there are 80 powers in champions, and you have maybe 10 of them, right? So there's 70 other powers you don't have yet. But of those 70, only maybe a dozen will fit your concept, and the others simply don't fit your concept, right? Same with skills, same with talents and perks. Lots of them are super useful in terms of game mechanics, but don't necessarily fit your character concept. And so instead of looking at all the champion's powers, and then by the way, all of those powers can have advantages and limitations on them, right? And so instead of saying, well, what type of attack power should I get and what type of advantages and limitations, there's so many permutations to this, I have no idea, right? Looking at the powers, what power would be useful? What power do I need to add to my multi-power? Right? I don't have an AP yet. Let me get an AP. I mean, you can do that. Armor piercing, right? You can do that. But a lot of times you're better off saying, well, what's the concept of this character? The concept of this character is that he has superhuman strength and speed, right? Because he was caught in some sort of a chemical accident, right? Well, what else? What other types of abilities does being caught in this chemical accident possibly imply? For example, I had a character named Enigma, who, when Multiform first came out, this was a concept based on a power, right? That she could change form into the different states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Well, she didn't turn into plasma. I think her main human form shot plasma bolts. But she could turn into, or maybe she could turn into plasma. I can't remember, but she turned into all these different forms. Right, but multi-form is expensive, and when I started playing the character, I didn't have enough points to make a good character with all the forms. So I started with like 2 forms. I was like plasma and solid or something. And then as she gained XP, right, I bought 2 more forms over many months of play. I bought 2 more forms, one that was liquid and one that was gas, and I came up with like what the powers would be and that sort of thing based on the fact that she had liquid and gas forms, right? That she was, because she could turn into plasma, she had the ability, sort of, plasma is just sort of atomic material that's kind of not organized into atoms the normal way. And so plasma, that's what the sun is largely made of, and plasma can kind of, in a way, become anything because it's not organized in the normal way. And so that's why she could become any kind of solid or liquid. So she could be liquid water, I think, but she could be solid lead or iron, right? She was sort of like a brick in that form. And her gaseous form was, I can't remember what she was. I think she was carbon dioxide. And so if she got into your hex or something, I think there was some way she could do some sort of an NND that was like suffocating you, right? Because it was carbon dioxide, it would knock you out. I can't remember exactly how I did it. And so the idea was that each form had its own traits based on what that state of matter and that chemical would be like, right? Not based on what would be the most effective thing to do for the character. And again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm poo-pooing, maybe it does, trying to be effective or optimized. It's not. I mean, I definitely tried to make the character effective when I created the forms, but the anchor for the concept was the 4 states of matter, and I was able to come up with like way more concepts and ideas for the states of matter and what they could do than anybody would ever have. We need 10,000 points to go with all the ideas that I came up with, right? In Champions, you're never going to get over 300 or 400 or 500 points. So there's no way you could do it all. But it did allow me to come up with enough concepts to make a really interesting and fun to play character who could do a lot of cool stuff that was based on just the idea of the character and what it was like, right? And so that's what I mean by, using the concept, right? Going concept first. A lot of times people get overwhelmed. Even my best friend, who's, he's a veteran gamer, he knows what he's doing. He was so overwhelmed by all the edges and stuff in Savage Worlds, he remade his character over and over and over and over and over again. In small ways, like I'm going to do this, and like he did all the advances and what he was going to do and planned it all the way out, and then he kept saying, "Oh, should I do this? Should I do that?" And I kept saying to him, "What's your concept?" He's like, "But all these things fit into the concept." Okay, then narrow down your concept, right? What are you trying to do here? And I don't know that he ever really answered that question because he was using the edges and the game mechanics to build the character, right? He had an idea, okay, she's a magical gunslinger, but beyond that, he didn't really have anything super narrowed down for the edges. Now, he did for her personality, right? So he had no, but even there, he kept changing her hindrances, right? Now, some of that was because one of the other players took one of the hindrances he wanted, and he said, I don't want us to be the same, But he was trying to figure out, okay, which hindrances work with these edges, right? which hindrances would be, would not work as well with these edges, right? And so in other words, you wouldn't make a pacifist gunslinger, right? I mean, you could certainly play that, but it wouldn't be super effective, right? It would be kind of a bit of a weird concept. I mean, you can see this in the Wonder Woman movie. There's a sniper, right, who's like got PTSD, and so what does Sammy say about him? He's a shooter, but he cannot shoot, right? In the one of the major scenes where they're in the town trying to save the village from the Germans, right? And there's a sniper. They try to get him to snipe back at the guy, and he can't do it, right? And so that's actually a super interesting character concept. But it's not something you'd come up with if you're making something from a game that has a sniper class, right? You wouldn't necessarily also come up with a character who was a sniper class and couldn't snipe. But it's a really interesting character concept, right? And so sometimes it can really help guide you as to what character you play. Here's an example. I never thought I would, play a sorcerer, but I actually think, I might conceptually think about this. I'd have to talk to my best friend if he's going to DM about how I would run this. And it might be like a multi-class where he's part sorcerer, part something else. But I got this idea from watching, and you can look at this up on YouTube. There's a let's play of Coffin Rock by one of these groups that does role-playing games on YouTube, and I can't remember the name, but you can, if you just YouTube search Coffin Rock, you can find it. They did a really nice job, and so there's a guy in there who's a huckster, which is what my best friend's character was, right? But what's awesome about it is because the huckster is like dealing with demons and stuff. I can't remember what his name is. Elliot Moore, I think. He's an awesome role player, this guy, and his character is a huckster, but he's like afraid of his own powers, right? He's afraid because he thinks what he's doing might be evil, and so he's afraid to use the deal with the devil ability, and he's afraid to call upon his own powers, and he does it a few times, but he has to like take a swig of alcohol and then make a vigor roll to avoid getting drunk and stuff like that. And I said, now what a cool concept to have this character that has all these cool abilities and is afraid to use them. So I said, I could see playing a sorcerer who's like a wild magic sorcerer, who's had the wild magic like blow up in his face enough times that he's afraid to use his own powers because he's afraid of what's going to happen. Right? It's sort of like the Thomas Covenant concept, if you've ever read the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, right? Where Covenant has the wild magic, and the wild magic can essentially break the world, and it can get out of his control. So even though he can do it, and it's basically a Deus Ex Machina god tier weapon, he like never wants to use it because he's always afraid that once he starts, he won't be able to stop, and that he's going to unmake the world, right? And in fact, that's what the evil villain Lord Fowl wants, right? He wants to get the wild magic ring, the white gold ring, from Thomas Covenant, and then he wants to use the wild magic to shatter the Arch of Time and break the world, and that will free him from his prison because he's trapped in the Arch of Time by God, by the Creator, right? And so Covenant, there's so many times when he can save their butts, especially in the second trilogy, where he can, once he knows how to use the wild magic, and he can save their butts, and he refuses to do it. And some of the other characters like Lyndon get really mad at him because, why won't you just use this thing? And he's like, because it's dangerous, right? And he's also afraid that once he starts, he can't stop. And so I thought to myself, I could see, even though I've never wanted to play a spellcaster, I could see playing a spellcaster, a sorcerer, who is like afraid to use his power, so he's like using a crossbow most of the time, and like he won't use cantrips because like that's just like just sort of what's the word? Indiscriminately using magic. He's not going to do that, right? He's afraid every time he uses magic that it's going to blow up and do something crazy. Probably because it's done it before and it's harmed people he's cared about. Maybe it like killed one of his family members or his girlfriend or whatever, and now he's like afraid to use it. Maybe even make him uh, disabled in some way, like he lost an eye or something because he put out his own eye with the wild magic or something like that, and therefore he's partially blinded or something. There's no real way to give yourself like actual hindrances that haven't game mechanical effects in D&D. Um, but I could see doing something like giving him a lower dex than normal, right? I mean, the typical thing to do with a magic user, like a sorcerer, is to give them their max stat in their spellcasting stat, and then give their next two stats, dexterity and constitution, because it gives them hit points and some armor class. But I could totally see this guy having a crappy dex because he can't see well, because he's got, or maybe a low wisdom, so he's got crappy perception because he's missing an eye, or I don't know, something like that. I don't know how I would actually formulate it, but the idea is that with this concept, I could easily see, okay, I'm going to actually take some like multi-class, and I'm going to take some levels of maybe rogue or something, or fighter or monk, right? He's sort of learning how to fight, like fisticuffs and stuff. Or I feel like rogue is probably the more likely option, and not taking arcane trickster, but basically being a scout, or maybe being a fighter, right? Where he's sort of like, I'm taking more levels of sorcerer than fighter for him, but he keeps trying to be a fighter because he's afraid of his own magical abilities, and he's afraid that they're going to get somebody killed or get him killed, put out his other eye, whatever. And so he would be very hesitant to use his magic because of the wild magic and the fact that things could blow up in his face and stuff. That kind of concept is really awesome. And once you have that concept, then it's really easy to see, like, you're not going to take feats that make you a better spellcaster, because you want to fail at spellcasting sometimes so that the wild magic goes off, right? And also because he's not trying to train himself in it that much because he's afraid of it, right? So you have this character who's like half fighter, half sorcerer, who's afraid of the sorcerer powers. Or maybe a warlock who's afraid of his own patron. Maybe he made a deal with a patron to save his own life, and now he's reluctant to call on the patron's powers because he feels like he's getting in deeper with this evil thing. That's another cool concept that I could possibly see doing too. And so I feel like once you have a concept like that, then figuring out what skills and abilities and what levels to take and edges and Savage Worlds powers and champions becomes much easier to figure out than if you're just like, well, what's the optimal thing for a warlock? Well, if you're going to do an optimal warlock, right, that's where you get into these builds that are basically all the same, right? There are certain subclasses that are considered by far the best. I think Hexblade is one of them. So you would take that one and not Great Old One or whatever. You're going to take a race that gives you high charisma, so maybe a tiefling, right? So there are lots of people that end up with like a tiefling, Hexblade, warlock, right? And then they take, all the same spells, right? What is it? Eldritch Blast and Witchblade or something like that, Witch Bolt, and a couple other ones that are like the bread and butter ones of the warlock, based on the fact that the warlock doesn't get as many spell slots as the other casters do, and so they have a much smaller repertoire. So you have to be very sort of, what's the word, economical about which spells you take, and try to take ones that are going to be like really good. But I could easily see someone who's like, I'm not going to take Eldritch Blast, the cantrip, and or if I take it, I'm not going to use it much because, like, I feel like every time I tap into the powers of this patron, he gets a stronger hold over me, right? And so, um, so it, the idea is that when you have a good concept, it's actually not that hard to look at all of the level up options, all the feats and stuff, and say, well, this fits my character. Um, in my Deadlands game, one of the players is playing coins. The coins are all good. It looks like is playing a witch character who's like, she's sort of a witch but doesn't realize she's a witch, so she's sort of almost like doing the powers unconsciously, right? And so that gives him a series of options that he both can or should and can't or shouldn't take, right? Options that are like, well, I don't want my character to have this option because that would mean that the character would have more conscious control over her powers, and I want them to be more unconscious, right? I want it to be something that she doesn't realize she's doing it, right? So like she can summon a ghost, right? She's like summon creature or whatever, the summon spell. So she can summon a ghost, but what she does is she panics and she calls her mama who's dead, mama, 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 or daddy, 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 and the ghost appears and helps her. She doesn't know she's summoning it, right? She thinks that this is just the ghosts of her parents who are coming to help her, right? So then that implies certain things about how he role plays the character, right? And also things about what you're going to do when you level up, when you take advances, right? So any edges that would like give the character more conscious control or a longer duration of that power, she probably wouldn't take, because that would fly in the face of the idea of the conscious control, right? Which she doesn't have, right? She doesn't consciously control. She doesn't even understand what she's doing when she uses these powers, right? And so he specifically took powers that he thought she could use without realizing it, right? So like empathy, right? Her eyes kind of glow a little bit and she tries to understand the feelings of the other person. But again, she doesn't know she's casting a spell or doing witchcraft. She just thinks she's empathizing with the person, right? She just thinks that she's sympathizing or feeling what they feel, right? So she doesn't realize anything supernatural is actually happening. And so then you have to pick powers. Like, he's not going to take blast, right? Because she would have to be blasting stuff out of her hands or something, and that wouldn't be something that would be unconscious, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're struggling with what choices to take in Pathfinder, right? This guy was saying, oh, there's like 40 different things I can do when I go from level 1 to level 2, and I don't know which one's the most effective. They're all good options, and I'm like, you just pick the one that's in concept for your character, right? One of them is going to pop as this is the one that fits the way my character is and who they are as a person, and it'll reinforce what I already have, and that's not statistically but conceptually. That can really help you narrow down your options and come up with what you want to do for your next advance or next level or your next set of powers in Champions. So anyway, those are my thoughts on making up characters and character concept. Until next time, guys, I'm Scrapperlock, and this has been Let's Play Power Wash Simulator. Let's rant with Scrapper.